So maybe you've picked up on this already, but what we are doing today is a little unusual. But after all, we are living in unusual times, and that affects every area of our lives and has for these last several months, from work to school to recreation, and that also includes church. This pandemic has forced us to adapt over the last few months, and sometimes to adapt very quickly. We're doing things very differently than the way we've done them for many years. Last week we had our worship service outside, in the parking lot, and in the evening, not in the morning. Today, several of us are back here in the church building, though we're split between two worship services, and several are joining us online. This is unusual. So I've been preaching over Deuteronomy this summer, and some of you may have thought that is unusual. Now, I've mentioned that this was my plan for the summer even before the pandemic hit us. And for the first couple of months in the spring, I changed my existing sermon plans to speak directly and topically to our quarantined lives. But in June, I decided to go ahead and double down with Deuteronomy. Because after all, this was a book written to a people who are in transition and change, trusting God to lead them safely into something good. And isn't that us right now? I've been amazed how I have heard Deuteronomy speaking to us now in 2020. Though it was written a long time ago to a people in a very different situation than us, the scriptures have a knack for finding relevancy across the generations. Now, many modern Christians consider Deuteronomy to be boring or no longer applicable, and I like to push back against that idea. These are the last words of Moses. It is a pep talk, getting the Israelites excited as they are finally about to cross into the promised land of Canaan. But it's also a series of reminders of what their covenant relationship to God means and the importance of remaining faithful and obedient to God, just as God has remained faithful to them. And these are lessons that are still true today. All that being said, I've struggled a little this week preparing the sermon. First, I'm trying to keep this down to 15 minutes, which we'll see how well I do with that. I'm a talker. But another thing is, months ago, back in January, I went through Deuteronomy and I outlined each lesson and the planned texts that I would use. And today we are in chapter 12. And halfway through this week, I thought about skipping it. Let's just skip over that lesson, move on to the next one. No one will know the difference. And I will confess to you, it's a little boring. Not a lot boring, but Deuteronomy 12 seems a little irrelevant. Here, Moses is talking to his people about worship. And you might ask, well, how can worship be boring or irrelevant? Well, the way that the Israelites worshiped God was a lot different than we do today, and so it can be hard for us to relate. But to be fair, the way that they worshiped was a lot different than everyone else at the time, too. And that was actually the point. Their worship was distinct. The promised land of Canaan that they were entering into was filled with Canaanites who worshiped the pantheon of Canaanite gods like Baal and Asherah. And as such, there were altars and shrines to their gods everywhere. But that would not be the case for Israel. Taking a look at Deuteronomy chapter 12, we read in verse 1 the following. These are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess, as long as you live in the land. Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from those places. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, but you are to seek the places the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. To that place you must go. There bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, what you have vowed to give in your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. There, in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your family shall eat and shall rejoice in everything you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you. Eating and rejoicing is a form of worship that I can totally get behind. Now, I'm not joking every time I tell you that potlucks are an act of worship, one that I dearly miss and greatly anticipate, by the way. All Jewish religious festivals and holidays were feasts, and that is my favorite way to celebrate. But unlike ancient Israel, we don't offer sacrifices or burnt offerings anymore. And I know some of you are hunters and you can do this, but I've recently been watching one of those outdoor survival shows, and skinning and preparing an animal, it just isn't my thing. I look at them doing that and like, nah, thanks. So I'm okay with not sacrificing anymore. But that's not a luxury that people have had until modern times, though. And for the Israelites, according to Leviticus, every time they slaughtered livestock like oxen, goats, or cattle, they were to take it to the tabernacle and offer it as a sacrifice to God first, giving thanks for the animal's life before they were allowed to eat it. And that's not a bad practice, if you ask me. Probably a lot better than our modern practice of slaughterhouses or meat processing facilities, as they're called today. This was required for livestock that they raised, but it wasn't for the wild game that they hunted. By requiring their raised livestock to be sacrificed at the tabernacle, it ensured that they would not be sacrificed at any pagan idols or shrines. But here's the thing. Something else that was distinct was that the Israelites had only one sanctuary. And for the last 40 years, that had been the tabernacle, that portable tent that they had carried with them wherever they went. And eventually, the tabernacle would be replaced by the temple in Jerusalem. But that wouldn't be for a few centuries. And in the interim time, the tabernacle would remain, but that it would no longer be around the people all the time. They would spread out into the vast country, which meant that sometimes they would have to travel quite a journey to get back to the tabernacle in order for them to worship. And it's interesting that the location is not named ahead of time, but instead it's just said to be the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. See, before Jerusalem, this was a few locations, including Shiloh. But that didn't matter. What matters is not where, but who. The geographical location of the sanctuary did not matter, but what matters was that the Spirit of God dwelt there in the most holy place. But the geography did matter to you if you had to travel a couple of days to get there just to eat one of your goats. With the people now spreading out into the land, that was going to be a problem. Basically limiting them to a vegetarian diet supplemented by whatever they could hunt. And so Moses does something unusual. He doesn't insist that they just deal with it, hammering Leviticus down on them. Instead, he tells them that God was giving them permission to change. Verse 20 reads this: When the Lord your God has enlarged your territory as he promised you, and you crave meat and say, I would like some meat, then you may eat as much of it as you want. If the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far away for you, you may slaughter animals from the herds and flocks the Lord has given you, as I have commanded you. And in your towns you may eat as much of them as you want. And Moses tells them that if they were to make a sacrifice, it always had to be at the tabernacle, wherever it was. But if it was just for food, they could eat the livestock just as if it were wild game, without sacrificing it first. They were given freedom. I bet that they were relieved. And maybe this is interesting to you, at least from a historical perspective at least, but honestly, so what? What does this mean for God's people today? Now, I said earlier that this chapter seems irrelevant to us 21st century Christians. And I've been wondering, all right, so what do I say about it? But I've been thinking that maybe that is the point. We don't have to worry about stuff like sacrifices and where we can or cannot worship. And this pandemic has been proving it. The Israelites could not worship over Zoom. They had to travel to Jerusalem or wherever the sanctuary was, because that is where God was. But that is not the case for Christians. This may be the first time in months that some of us have been in this church building, but that has not stopped us from worshiping God. I mean, this building is nice and it's convenient, but neither the building nor the location is sacred, hallowed ground. This is not the tabernacle or the temple. Deuteronomy was foreshadowing the future, pointing to the truth that it is not about where, but who. It's not about geography, but it is about the God who dwells there. Now, Christians don't have a tabernacle or a temple. We don't have shrines or altars. Instead, we believe that we are God's temple. For the Spirit of God no longer dwells in the most holy place, but the Spirit dwells within our hearts. Because Jesus poured the Holy Spirit out on all believers on the day of Pentecost, our place of worship became even more portable than it was the tent of the tabernacle. We don't have to travel anywhere in particular to find God, to worship him. We could gather in the middle of a field. We could be in an underground cave, and that would be okay. These last few months that we have been meeting on the internet have been perfectly acceptable worship to God because God has been in our midst. God is present with us even if we are not present with each other. God is greater than the space between us, whether it is 6 feet or 600 miles. You may feel bad for the Israelites, and I certainly don't envy them. Why the inconvenience? Why couldn't they just set up a shrine in their village where they could sacrifice to God and worship God there? Well, the reason was because unlike the Canaanites, the God of Israel could not be worshipped by individuals. Worship was a community event. And I mean, that's the point of the feasts and the festivals. God did not care about the sacrifices, which is why he gave them more freedom. God cares about the people. And the people of God would come from all over the promised land and come together to worship God as one united community. And so even then we see that worshiping God is not something you do, but something we do. Together they would eat and rejoice. Worshiping God is an act of communal joy. And thousands of years later, we continue to do that today. Every Sunday, we worship at a feast. We call it the Lord's Supper. And lately, we've been using these little prepackaged communion elements, which are not what I'd call a feast or even a nice snack, but they're safe. And the Lord's Supper has become more symbolic to us than the feasts of Israel's, but the significance is still there. Every Sunday, we eat and drink together at the Lord's table, rejoicing together because God has blessed us. The sacrifice once and for all is Jesus Christ, and we remember his body and his blood, giving thanks for his life. We do not do this alone, but we do this together as one united worshiping community, not bound by the limitations of this room, but we join together with all of our brothers and sisters in Christ who are joining us at the Lord's table throughout the world on this day. So what we're doing today may be a little unusual and different than what we're used to. But regardless, we are worshiping our God. And wherever we are, let us worship our God together. And in all things, may God receive all glory and praise. I'd like to end with the blessing of Moses, which he often spoke to the people of Israel thousands of years ago, which I say to you today: the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.